He had more land than most men could ride across in a week, more gold than any single life could spend, and not one person in the world who looked at him without calculating what he was worth. The richest man in the Western Territory stood alone at midnight in a house built for 50 and decided he would rather die as nobody than live another day as Callum Rourke. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. The evening Callum Rourke made the decision that would unravel everything he had built, he was sitting across from Senator Gerald Whitmore in the finest study west of the Mississippi, listening to a speech he had already heard a dozen times before. The railroad extension through the valley would be transformative, Callum. Transformative. We're talking about commerce, about growth, about the future of this entire region. Whitmore leaned forward over the mahogany desk, his silver cufflinks catching the lamplight, his smile practiced to the precise degree of warmth that men of power deployed when they needed something. Your cattle operation alone stands to triple in value within 5 years. Triple. You understand what I'm saying to you? Callum sat in the leather chair across from the senator and watched the man's eyes. Not his mouth, which said all the right things, but his eyes, which said something else entirely. The eyes were doing arithmetic. They had been doing arithmetic since the moment Whitmore stepped through the front door. How much? Callum said. Whitmore blinked. I beg your pardon. How much do you need from me to make this happen? The senator's expression moved through surprise, then recalibration, then something almost like relief at being able to drop the pretense. Well, I hadn't intended to approach the matter quite so directly, but since you ask, $18,000 would secure the initial survey rights in the first stage of, I'll wire $20,000 tomorrow. Callum set down his bourbon glass. Is there anything else? Whitmore stammered through his gratitude, a performance that had clearly been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Callum watched him the way a man watches weather moving across a distant plain with neither interest nor investment. When the senator finally ran out of compliments and took his leave, the house settled back into its usual silence, and Callum sat in the lamplight for a long time staring at nothing. He owned this house. He owned the valley visible from every window. He owned the cattle that grazed on the grass. His money had irrigated the barns that held grain. His contracts had secured the fences that marked borders his lawyers had fought for. 3 years ago, closing the deal that had made him the single largest landowner in the Wyoming Territory, he had sat in the same chair with the finest bourbon money could import and realized he had no one to share the victory with. Not one person who would have celebrated the man rather than the fortune. He had tried everything that wealth could buy. Women who smiled too quickly and left too easily. Business partners who laughed at his jokes and vanished when the ledgers didn't suit them. A house full of staff who called him sir with perfect deference and knew nothing about him at all. An entire empire populated by people who saw opportunity when they looked at Callum Rourke and nothing else. The thought arrived quietly the way dangerous thoughts usually did. What if he left? Not departed for a business trip, not retreated to the lodge in the mountains for a week of hunting. What if he left everything, stripped himself down to nothing, and walked into a place where nobody knew his name or the number attached to it? What if he became a man without money, without history, without the invisible sign hanging over his head that said, here is a resource, here is a transaction, here is something useful? What if someone saw him then? Callum Rourke disappeared on a Tuesday morning before the household was awake. He had spent the previous day making quiet arrangements. A sealed letter left on his desk for Thomas, his butler, contained instructions to manage the estate, as usual a bank draft for 6 months of operating expenses, and a bonus for every member of the staff. The letter said, I will return when I am ready. Do not look for me. He saddled his own horse in the gray pre-dawn, wearing clothes borrowed from the bunkhouse. Torn canvas trousers, a faded work shirt that had belonged to one of the ranch hands, scuffed boots that had walked 1,000 hard miles before he put them on. In the saddlebag, $50 a canteen, a Bowie knife, and a territorial map that was at least 10 years out of date. No identification, no letters of credit, no proof of anything. He rode east as the sun came up behind him, and the mansion shrank in the distance until it was gone, and Callum Rourke felt for the first time in 20 years something that might have been freedom. He spent 3 days riding through country that grew increasingly raw and empty, sleeping, rough eating, whatever he could buy at trading posts where nobody looked at him twice. On the second night, sheltering from rain under a limestone overhang, he chose a name from a grave marker in a small cemetery nearby. Coal Marsh. Simple. forgettable. The kind of name that didn't make people look up. Red Spur, Wyoming announced itself with a hand-lettered sign on a post leaning at roughly 30 degrees from vertical. The sign had been repainted at least twice each layer, slightly off-center from the last, giving it the look of a man who had tried to straighten himself up and failed. The town itself was exactly what the sign suggested. A single unpaved street, wide enough for two wagons to pass if they were both cooperative about it. Buildings that had been thrown up fast and never quite finished, their raw wood faded to gray by sun and wind, and the particular indifference that frontier construction inspired. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as the town hall on Sundays and court on Mondays, a boarding house with a crooked porch, a church with a crooked steeple, and scattered between them small enterprises of survival, a seamstress, a barber, a harness maker, a place that seemed to sell rope and nothing else. Callum rode in on a Thursday afternoon and tied his horse at the public well in the center of the square. His body ached from 3 days in the saddle. His throat was dust. He worked the well crank until the bucket came up, and he drank from it without ceremony, too thirsty to care about appearances. When he surfaced, someone was watching him. She was standing at the corner of a small building across the square, a structure barely larger than a tool shed, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read, Shen's Laundry in careful letters. She was Chinese, somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, in a plain cotton dress that had been washed so many times the original color was a matter of speculation. Her hands, even from this distance, were visibly reddened, the kind of damage that came from years of lye soap and scalding water, the kind that never quite healed no matter how much care you took. But her eyes, that was what stopped him. Not suspicious, not calculating, not performing anything at all. Just looking at him with a directness that was neither intrusive nor hostile, a simple, honest attention that he realized he had not received from another human being in longer than he could account for. She walked toward him, carrying a dented tin cup. She moved without hurry, her steps unhurried in the dust, and she stopped 2 feet away and dipped the cup into the bucket still hanging from the rope. "You look thirsty," she said. Her English was careful and precise, each word chosen like a stone placed in a wall. Callum stared at the cup. He could not remember the last time anyone had done something for him without expecting anything in return. He tried to trace it back through all the years of wealth and power and the endless procession of transactional relationships, and he could not find it. He was so accustomed to the hidden arithmetic behind every gesture that the absence of it here in this simple offering of water in a dented cup hit him with a force that was almost physical. "Thank you," he said, and took the cup carefully. Their fingers didn't touch. He drank. When he handed the cup back, she took it, gave a small nod, and walked away without another word. No lingering for acknowledgement. No waiting to see what the gesture had purchased. Callum stood at the well for a long time after she disappeared through the laundry door, feeling something stir in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Not quite recognition, closer to hunger. The particular hunger of a man who has eaten nothing but substitutes for so long that he has almost forgotten what real food tastes like. He found work before sunset. The boarding house was run by a woman named Dora Vance, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with the particular brand of no-nonsense practicality that came from decades of dealing with drifters and ne'er-do-wells and the occasional honest man. She studied Callum the way a horse trader studies a questionable animal looking for hidden vices. "Done ranch work?" she asked, arms folded. Some, Callum said. It was not precisely a lie. He had owned ranches for 15 years. He had simply never worked on one. "Your hands say otherwise." She had noticed his palms, which were soft in a way that no ranch hand's hands had ever been. "But Hank Doyle needs help at the freight yard. $1 a day if you can keep up." She tilted her head. "You running from something, Cole Grant?" He had almost forgotten his alias. "Marsh," he said. "Cole Marsh." "Cole Marsh, then. Running from something." "No, ma'am. Running towards something." He thought about it. "Maybe." Dora grunted, unimpressed but apparently satisfied. $2 a week, meals included, rooms in the back. Don't make noise after 9. He handed her $4, 2 weeks in advance. She pocketed the money and looked at him again, this time with a fraction less suspicion. "Freight yard opens at dawn," she said. "Don't be late." Hank Doyle was a freight master, built like a barn door, with a beard like an unmowed field, and a voice that could be heard from one end of Red Spur to the other without effort. He met Callum at the yard gate the following morning with the particular skepticism that experienced workers reserve for the inexperienced who think they're ready. "See that wagon?" Doyle said, jerking his thumb at a flatbed loaded with grain sacks. There had to be 200 of them, each one weighing close to 100 pounds. "Unload it by noon, stack them in the barn, and don't tear the sacks." Callum looked at the wagon. He looked at his hands. "Yes, sir." Doyle smiled the smile of a man who has seen this before. "Get moving, then." By the time the sun cleared the roofline, Callum's back was screaming. By mid-morning, he could feel every heartbeat in his palms where the rope handles had cut into flesh that had never been asked to do this. By 11 o'clock, he was running on something that was not quite strength, but was not quite its absence. Either some combination of stubbornness and the grim understanding that he had done this to himself, and there was no walking away from it. He unloaded 172 sacks before noon. Doyle walked over, counted the remaining pile, and shook his head. "Not fast enough. I'll be faster tomorrow." The freight master studied him. Most men quit after the first hour. He could see it in the man's eyes, the combination of surprise and grudging reassessment. "Try again tomorrow," Doyle said and tossed him a canteen. That night, Callum lay in the narrow boarding house bed with his hands wrapped in torn strips of his extra shirt, every muscle in his body cataloging its specific objection, and he slept more deeply than he had in years. The work shaped him in ways he had not anticipated. After 2 weeks, his hands had stopped bleeding and started roughening. After a month, the rope no longer cut. After 6 weeks, he was keeping pace with men who had been doing this work for decades, and Hank Doyle had stopped watching him with the expression of a man waiting for something to break. "You're tougher than you look," Doyle said one afternoon, which was as close to a compliment as the freight master appeared to get. "I had motivation," Callum said. "What kind of motivation?" Callum looked across the square to where the laundry sign was visible above the other roof lines. "The kind that keeps you showing up." Doyle followed his gaze and said nothing, but the faint shift in his expression suggested he had drawn his own conclusions. The small courtesies had started in the second week. Callum walked past the laundry every evening on his route from the freight yard to the boarding house, and somewhere in the third or fourth pass, he noticed that the tin cup sometimes appeared on the railing outside the laundry door. He never asked if it was for him. He always drank from it, rinsing it carefully and setting it back, and walked on without stopping. Once a Thursday in late September, he arrived to find Mei Shen struggling with a basket of wet laundry, trying to heave it up onto the porch railing to sort. The basket was enormous, and she was not, and the physics of the situation were clearly not in her favor. Callum stopped. "Need help." She looked up at him, startled, and he saw the moment of calculation that everyone performs when a stranger offers assistance, the brief assessment of risk. Then she stepped back. "Please." He lifted the basket easily. Months of freight work had given him a functional relationship with heavy objects. He set it on the railing where she needed it and stepped back. "Thank you," she said. "No trouble." He turned to go. "Wait." He stopped. She disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a small cloth bundle. She held it out without explanation. Inside, a piece of dark bread, a portion of dried meat, some kind of preserved vegetable. It was the meal of someone who did not have much to spare and who was sharing it anyway. "You're always walking past when I'm closing," she said. "You must get hungry." "I can pay for—" "You work hard," she said simply. "Harder than most men I've seen." Callum looked at her. He looked at the mended dress, the reddened hands, the laundry visible through the open door where an older man moved slowly in the back room. He looked at the smallness of the business and understood without being told what every one of those dollars meant, what it cost her to offer 2 of them in dried bread and jerked meat. He took the bundle. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended. She nodded and went back inside. Callum stood on the porch for a moment holding the bundle, and he could not have said if anyone had asked him whether what he felt was gratitude or something that went considerably further than that. He began finding small ways to help after that, the way a man builds something without admitting to himself that he's building it one stone at a time. When the rain barrel beside the laundry developed a crack that was letting water seep into the foundation, he fixed it after dark with borrowed tools and tar. When the older man May's father needed firewood in advance of an early cold snap, Callum left a cord of it stacked beside the door before dawn. When a section of the laundry's roof began weeping rust-colored water during an October storm, he climbed up while May was at the general store and patched it with shingles he had bought with his own money and cut himself. She never said anything about any of it. But the next time he walked past the laundry in the evening, there was a full meal waiting on the railing. Still warm, wrapped in cloth. The kind of meal that took time and care to prepare, not the quick offering of leftover bread. He stood there a moment looking at it, then sat down on the step and ate it, watching the last light leave the sky, and felt something that he suspected might be happiness, or at least a close neighbor to it. October brought the drought's consequences to a head. The creek that fed Red Spur's wells had been slowing since August. Callum had noticed it had made the observation, the way a man who has managed large agricultural operations tends to notice water, with the particular attention of someone who understands what its absence means. The wells had been dropping. The rain that usually soaked the Wyoming plateau in autumn had not materialized. The air was dry in a way that felt almost aggressive, and the dust it stirred got into everything. The laundry suffered first and worst. Mei needed water in quantities that most of the town's businesses did not, and the failing well meant increasingly difficult choices. Callum watched her make the 2-mile walk to the creek with empty buckets 3 times one morning, her arms shaking by the third trip, her pace slowing with each return. That evening, he made the walk himself, filling every container he could borrow or improvise, and left them outside the laundry door before she opened in the morning. When she found them, she stood on the porch in the early light and looked at the containers for a long time, her expression unreadable. Callum watched from the shadows on the far side of the square. He had money enough to solve this problem properly. One telegram to his lawyers could arrange to have water brought in by the barrel, could hire men to dig a deeper well, could do any number of things that would make this easier. But that money was Victor Rourke's money. And the moment Victor Rourke appeared in this equation, Coalmarsh disappeared, and so did everything that had grown between them in the careful quiet of these weeks. The landlord arrived in the first week of November. His name was Denton Frey, and he had the kind of face that would have been handsome if the expression behind it had been anything other than what it was. He was thin and well-dressed in the way of a man who considers himself several steps above the town he operates in, with the particular smile of someone who has learned that the appearance of reasonableness can accomplish what overt hostility sometimes cannot. Callum was hauling stone for the new church foundation when he saw Frey knock on the laundry door. He didn't stop working, but he watched. The conversation was short. Frey spoke. Mei listened, and whatever he said turned her face a shade of white that had nothing to do with the cold. When Frey left, he was smiling. Mei stood in the doorway, gripping the frame with both hands, as though the building might otherwise move away from her. Callum set down the stone he was carrying and crossed the square. What did he want? Mei looked at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Not the quiet composure she carried into every ordinary moment. Something smaller and more frightened than that. More rent, she said, double, starting the 1st of December. Can you pay it? She shook her head, the movement barely perceptible. We barely cover what we owe now. Without the well, fewer people are bringing laundry. The women who used to come every week are coming every 2 weeks. The families who were bringing their heavy loads. She stopped, pressed her lips together. There was a discipline in that silence that Callum recognized, the discipline of a person who has taught themselves not to give the full weight of their fear an audience. I'll find a way, she said, and the composure was back, armor back in place. We always do. She went inside and closed the door gently, as if she were being careful not to disturb anything fragile. Callum stood in the square with his fists clenched at his sides, and the Montana cold cutting through his work shirt, in the certain knowledge that he could solve this in a single afternoon if he chose to. He had solved problems of this scale 100 times. He knew exactly what Frey was doing, knew the playbook better than Frey did, because he had watched men like Frey operate from the other side of the table. He could not use that knowledge, not without becoming himself again. And becoming himself again in this particular moment, in this particular place, felt like the worst thing he could do. 2 days later, a lawyer from 3 counties over arrived in Red Spur and presented Denton Frey with a cash offer on the laundry building. Anonymous buyer. The price was triple the property's assessed value. Frey, who was a practical man in all the ways that mattered to Frey, accepted without asking questions. The following morning, Mei found a letter under the laundry door. The building had been purchased by a distant benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. Rent was forgiven. The deed was transferring to her name. The letter was written in a deliberate hand that bore no resemblance to Callum's own, which he had practiced for an hour the night before to be sure. She read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to the boarding house and found Callum eating breakfast. Did you do this? She asked. Callum looked up. His heart was doing something complicated. Do what? Someone bought the building. The rent is gone. The deed is being transferred. She held the letter like evidence. Was it you? He met her eyes and kept his expression steady, by an act of will that cost him considerably. How could it be me? I make $1 a day hauling freight. She studied him. He watched the calculation move across her face, the reasonable mind working through the reasonable math and arriving at the reasonable conclusion that coal marsh day laborer could not have purchased a building in the night. She nodded slowly. I suppose you are right. She turned to go, then paused. Whoever it was, she said, I wish I could thank them. I'm sure they know, Callum said. She left. Callum sat alone in the dining hall with his half-eaten breakfast and felt the weight of what he had done settle over him. He had saved her. It should have felt like something good. Instead, it felt like the first crack in a foundation he had been building carefully for months. The first indication that the thing he had constructed here was sitting on ground that might not hold. Because saving her had required him to use Victor Rourke's money. And Victor Rourke's money was a lie that the man called Coal Marsh was living inside of, and sooner or later lies collapsed under their own weight. He had known that in the abstract when he started this. He had not understood in the abstract what it would cost him when it happened. December in Red Spur settled the dust and frosted the mud and made everything quieter and harder and more honest in the way that cold weather does to frontier places. The wood smoke from the stoves along the main street gave the whole town a softer smell, and the conversations that Callum and Mei had developed, tentative at first and then less so, moved indoors, to the laundry's front steps if the afternoon was mild enough, or to the small table near the window, where Mei sometimes sat with her mending in the evenings when the work was done. They talked about small things and then larger ones. She told him about crossing the Pacific as a child, about her mother dying 3 months before they reached San Francisco, about her father learning the laundry trade in a city that didn't particularly want them, and then moving further east in search of something that might. About building the business in Red Spur, from the floor up, literally laying the boards themselves because hiring help had not been an option. We survived, she said one evening, the words carrying the specific weight of things that have cost everything. That's what matters. You did more than survive, Callum said. She looked at him across the small table, and he saw in her eyes the thing he always saw there, that clear, honest attention that had nothing behind it but itself. What about you, she asked. Where are you from, Cole? He had prepared for this. He had rehearsed the simple lies that would close the question off and move them past it safely. But looking at her now, at the directness of her, he found the prepared words would not come. A place, he said, where people only ever saw what I could give them. He paused. Not who I was. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw warm light across the table and the mended cloth in her hands. I understand that, she said, and he believed her. Completely and without reservation, he believed her. On Christmas Eve, Red Spur crowded itself into the saloon for a celebration that was modest by any measurable standard and entirely genuine in every way that mattered. Someone had donated a pine bough. Someone else had found a fiddle player. There was food on the tables, enough of it, and the lamps had been trimmed up bright, and the particular warmth of people who have survived something difficult together filled the room like a second kind of heat. Callum stood near the back wall with a cup of coffee watching. Somewhere in the last few months, without his intending it or quite noticing when it happened, these people had become something to him. Hank Doyle, who had worked him half to death and slowly come to respect him. Dora Vance, whose sharp eyes had softened incrementally as the weeks passed. Old Man Prescott from the general store, whose bad knee Callum had quietly helped with by taking over the heavy lifting on delivery days. The younger workers in the freight yard, who had started deferring to his judgment on things without understanding why. And then Mei was beside him. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, dark blue, simple in cut, with a kind of careful alterations that marked it as something she had made herself or refashioned from something else. It fit well. She carried herself in it the way she carried herself in everything, without ceremony, without performance. You're not dancing, she said. I don't know how. Neither do I. She stood beside him, watching the room close enough that he could hear her breathing over the fiddle music. After a moment, she said very quietly, thank you. He looked at her. For what? For being here. A pause. For being real. Something tightened in his chest, painful and precise. Real. The word landed on him like a stone dropped from height. Because she believed it. She said it with the full weight of her trust behind it, and that trust was built on a foundation that had a lie in it, buried down at the bottom where it had seemed safe to put it, and he was starting to understand that nothing buried stays buried forever. You're welcome, he managed. She reached out and touched his hand. Not a grasp, not a hold. A touch, the back of her fingers against the back of his for perhaps 3 seconds, and then she was gone, moving back into the celebration, leaving him standing against the wall, with the warmth of that contact burning through him like something branded. He had never felt more seen in his life. He had never felt more like a fraud. The unraveling arrived on a Tuesday in January on a tall horse with polished boots. Edgar Pell was a cattle rancher from 2 territories over a man whose business had crossed Callum's professional path a dozen times over the years. He had been to the mansion. He had sat at the dining table. He was the kind of man who remembered faces and forgot reasons to be discreet, and he rode into Red Spur at 2 in the afternoon while Callum was loading a wagon at the freight yard, and he spotted Callum from 20 feet away and started grinning like Christmas had come twice. "Well, I'll be goddamned," Pell said loud enough for half the square to hear. Callum felt the blood leave his face. He set down the sack he was carrying with the controlled care of a man who is not going to let himself run, even though every animal instinct is telling him to. "Callum Rourke," Pell announced, pulling his horse up and laughing. "What in the hell are you doing in a place like this?" The richest man in the Wyoming Territory, hauling grain sacks like a stable hand. He broke off to laugh again, shaking his head. "Wait until I tell people. They will never believe it." The freight yard had gone silent. The square was going silent around it. Callum looked at Pell with the steady eyes of a man who was past the point of hoping, who has arrived at the place beyond hope where only response is left. "Edgar," he said quietly, "leave." Pell blinked. "I just got here. Leave." The word was quiet and final, and whatever Pell saw in Callum's face crossed the distance between them and landed clearly. The rancher's laughter died. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, working faces that had gone hard and still and watchful in the way of people who have just discovered they are characters in someone else's story. "Fine," Pell said slowly. "Suit yourself." He pulled his horse around and rode out of the square at a trot, throwing one puzzled look back over his shoulder. Callum turned. Mei was standing in the laundry doorway. She had been closing up. She had heard everything. She was looking at him with an expression he could not read, and for a moment the world consisted entirely of the distance between them and the way she was looking across it, and then her expression shifted in a way that was worse than anger. A quiet, careful shift that looked like something closing. "Were you ever real?" she asked. Her voice was so low he nearly missed it across the distance. Callum took a step toward her. "May, please." She stepped back, shook her head, the door closed. And Callum Rourke stood in the middle of Red Spur's main square, surrounded by people who now knew his name, with the specific silence of a man who has lost the only thing that ever mattered, falling around him like snow. The silence in Red Spur's main square lasted 6 seconds before it broke into pieces. Callum heard his name move through the gathered crowd in waves, fragments of it, catching and reforming, as people connected the name Edgar Pell had shouted with something they had not known they were missing. Callum Rourke, the cattle baron from the Western Territories. The man who owned more land than most counties, who had more lawyers than most men, had acquaintances who had ridden into their town 4 months ago on a borrowed horse and borrowed clothes and told them his name was Cole Marsh. Dora Vance came down off the boarding house steps with her arms crossed and her face set in the specific expression of a woman who has offered trust and discovered it was spent on the wrong purchase. "You've got 10 minutes to clear your things, Mr. Rourke. I don't rent to liars." Hank Doyle spat into the dirt. "And I don't employ them." The crowd thickened as word spread the way. Fire spreads efficiently and in all directions at once. Callum stood in the center of it and did not move, not because he had a defense, but because movement felt dishonest somehow. He had earned this. He understood that. Doyle moved to block the path toward the laundry, not aggressively, just solidly, a wall made of a man's principles about how things ought to be. "I'd leave that alone," he said. "I need to explain." Explain what? Doyle's voice was quiet and cold in a way that was worse than shouting. "That you turned this town to your personal experiment. That you had us believing you were just another working man, made fools of every one of us." "That's not what it was." "Then what was it?" Dora Vance had joined Doyle, and behind her Callum could see the blacksmith, the general store owner, 3 of the younger frayed hands' faces he had eaten with and worked alongside and told nothing of consequence about himself. "A rich man playing poor, testing us like we were animals to be observed." Callum looked at them one by one and found he had no answer. Not because the answer didn't exist, but because any answer he gave now would sound like what it was a man trying to salvage something with words after he had destroyed it with deception. "I didn't come here to mock anyone," he said finally. The words were inadequate. He knew it even as he said them. "What did you come here for?" Doyle asked. Callum looked toward the laundry door, which remained closed. "Something real," he said. Doyle's laugh was quiet and entirely without humor. "There's nothing real about a man who lies about his own name." He gathered his things from the boarding house room in silence. There was not much a spare shirt, the work clothes that were now genuinely his own, the $50 that felt simultaneously like a fortune and a joke. He passed the laundry on his way to the livery and did not stop, though every part of him fought for the right to knock on that door and speak the words that might make her understand. He could see her through the window, her silhouette moving in the back room, her father's voice low and concerned, and her answer too quiet to carry across the glass. He mounted his horse and rode west without looking back once. He made himself not look back. The Montana sky above the Western Territories was vast and indifferent, the kind of sky that makes a man understand his actual proportion to the world. And under it, Callum Rourke rode until dark made camp in a hollow between two hills, where the night wind could not find him easily, and sat by a fire that was more light than heat staring at his hands. He had built calluses on them for the first time in his life. He had built them doing honest work for honest money among people who had taken him at face value and treated him accordingly. These hands had fixed a laundry roof, had hauled water for a woman who couldn't manage alone, had left firewood at a door before dawn so an old man wouldn't have to go cold. And they had also written a letter in a disguised hand and purchased a building with money the recipient didn't know he had and called that help. He rode home the next morning. The mansion appeared on the horizon at mid-afternoon exactly as he had left it, which was of course how it would be. Empires did not notice when their emperors were absent. Thomas opened the door with professional deference, took Callum's horse and said, "Welcome home, sir. Shall I have your rooms prepared?" Callum walked inside without answering. The house felt like a museum of someone else's life. Every piece of furniture chosen to demonstrate wealth. Every painting acquired to signal culture. Every fixture installed because it was the most expensive available. He walked through the rooms the way a man walks through a place he has been told to memorize cataloging without connecting, and went upstairs to his study and sat behind the desk and looked at the estate reports stacked neatly in his absence. The ranch had prospered without him. Profits were up. 2 new contracts had been negotiated. His empire had barely registered his disappearance. He pushed the reports aside and stared east. The weeks that followed were the worst of his life, which was a strange thing to understand about yourself, when your life had contained no shortage of hardship. Not physical hardship, but hardship of the spirit, which turned out to be considerably harder to endure. He sat through meetings with Mayor Whitmore and smiled at the right moments and signed the checks and remembered none of it an hour later. He endured a visit from 2 business associates who wanted to discuss an opportunity in the copper mining territory and found he could not locate the part of himself that had once been interested in opportunities. He attended a dinner at the county commissioner's house and sat through 3 hours of exactly the kind of conversation he had fled the careful performance of social currency exchange among people who measured each other in acreage and cattle counts in the size of their operations, and drove home afterward through a night that tasted like ash. Thomas found him on the porch one evening standing in a coat that cost more than most men's monthly wages watching the dark eastern horizon. "Sir," Thomas said, "you should come inside. It's well below freezing." "I'm fine, Thomas." A pause. In 15 years of employment, Thomas had not once offered an unsolicited opinion. "If I may speak freely, sir." Callum said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. "You've been home for 3 weeks, Thomas said. In that time, you haven't touched your cigars, haven't read a single book, have sat in your study for hours at a stretch without completing any work that I can observe." Another pause. "You appear, sir, to be a man who has left something important behind." Callum's jaw tightened against the cold. "I hurt someone," he said. "Someone who didn't deserve it." "Then perhaps you should make it right." "I don't know how." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Perhaps, sir, you might start by figuring that out." He went back inside, and Callum stood alone on the frozen porch with that question and the eastern horizon in the specific silence of a man with everything and nothing. The answer came from a surveyor's report. It arrived in a stack of territorial documents in early February, one of dozens of routine updates that crossed his desk every month, and he would have filed it unread, as he usually did, except that the cover notation mentioned water rights in the Eastern Territories, and something in him that still belonged to Red Spur made him open it. The report confirmed what he had seen with his own eyes. The water table across the region was dropping. Wells that had run strong for decades were failing. The drought was not a local problem, but a regional one, and the eastern settlements were bearing the worst of it. Towns like Red Spur were struggling. But buried in the appendices and technical language that required patience to parse was something else. A reference to surveys conducted in the 1840s. A notation about underground spring systems west of Red Spur, beneath a section of rocky hillside that the early expedition teams had identified as geologically promising. The springs had never been developed. The terrain was too difficult, the bedrock too hard. But the surveyors had measured significant potential water flow. Callum read the passage 3 times. Then he laid the report aside and spread his collection of old territorial maps across the desk. Most of them were crude, drawn by expedition teams working by hand and guess. But they all showed the same thing in that western section, a notation in penciled handwriting that said springs possible, and a small symbol that the map makers used for underground water sources. He sat back in his square and felt something shift in his chest for the first time since he had ridden out of Red Spur. Words could not earn back what he had lost. Apologies were currency that he had already demonstrated an ability to counterfeit. He could not walk back into that town and explain himself, and even if he could, explanation was not the same as proof. But water. Water could save Red Spur, and maybe it could prove something about the man who called himself Cole Marsh. That he had not been entirely performance. That underneath the deception, something real had been operating all along. Callum was on the road before dawn the following morning. He took his horse a bedroll, 2 canteens, the surveyor's report, and a pickaxe. He left no note for Thomas this time. He knew where he was going and why, and he didn't need to explain it to anyone yet, because it might come to nothing, and he had told enough stories about things that turned out to be less than they appeared. He made camp in the hills west of Red Spur 3 nights later, far enough from town that no one would see him arrive, and far enough from the surveyor's marked location to require 2 hours of walking with the map each morning before he reached his digging site. The site was a rocky hillside, unremarkable from the outside, where a particular arrangement of limestone and granite suggested to someone who knew how to read it the presence of something below. The old surveyor's marks were still faintly visible on 2 of the larger boulders. Faded. But there. Callum drove the pickaxe into the frozen ground and began. The first swing rang off stone with a shock that traveled from his wrists to his shoulders. He adjusted his grip and swung again. The ground yielded perhaps 2 inches. He shifted position and attacked a different angle, chipping at the frozen earth along the edges of an embedded rock, working to loosen it rather than fight through it, and after an hour he had cleared perhaps 3 feet of surface debris and was looking at solid granite. He sat on the rock and looked at what he had done and laughed. A short, humorless sound that he directed at himself, at the particular absurdity of a man worth more than most small nations sitting alone on a frozen hillside with a pickaxe because he could think of no other way to be honest. He could hire a crew, could buy proper drilling equipment, could solve this the way Victor Rourke solved problems with money and organization and the efficient deployment of other people's labor. That would be Victor Rourke's work. What needed doing here was Cole Marsh's work. He swung again. The first week nearly broke him in ways that the freight yard had only suggested. The granite fought every inch. Some days he made progress clearing 2 or 3 feet of rock and compacted earth. Other days the stone simply refused him, and he spent 8 hours producing a 1/4 inch of movement and the intimate knowledge of exactly how hard a particular piece of Wyoming bedrock chose to be. His hands reopened along the old calluses. His back spoke to him in a vocabulary of very specific complaint. His vision blurred in the afternoons from the sustained effort of swinging a heavy tool all day in cold air. He wrapped his hands and kept digging. He was completely alone out here, and the solitude felt different from the solitude of the mansion. The mansion's silence was the silence of emptiness, of an absence of things that should have been present. This silence was the silence of simple fact. Just a man, just stone, just work. No expectations to perform against. No audience. No calculation. Just the honest effort of trying to make something right. On the 8th day, Tom Brewster found him. Callum heard boots on the rock before he heard the voice, and he looked up from 6 feet down in the excavation to find the freight master standing at the edge, looking down at him with an expression that contained several things at once, few of which Callum could immediately identify. "What in the hell are you doing?" Doyle said. Callum wiped sweat from his face with a forearm that was as dirty as the ground. "Digging." "I can see that. Why, there's a spring underground, according to the old surveys. If I can reach it, Red Spur will have water again." Doyle looked at the pit, looked at Callum's bandaged hands, looked back at the pit. "You're digging for a maybe. Alone with a pickaxe. I don't need more than that. You need 20 feet more by the look of your progress." Doyle's voice was flat. "You'll be dead before you hit 15. "Then I'll die trying." The freight master studied him for a long moment, the specific, unhurried scrutiny of a man who has spent decades making assessments of what is real and what is pretend. Then, to Callum's complete surprise, he climbed down into the pit. He picked up the iron pry bar that Callum had been using to lever loose boulders and positioned it against a particularly stubborn section of rock. "What are you doing?" Callum asked. "What does it look like?" "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Doyle heaved, muscles bunching under his jacket, and the boulder groaned and shifted. "I spent 30 years in these territories. I've seen a fair number of liars. Men who talk big and deliver nothing." He got the rock loose. It fell with a thud that sent up a small cloud of dust. He looked at Callum levelly. "You lied about your name, but you never lied about the work." Callum was quiet. "Maybe that counts for something," Doyle said. "Thank you," Callum managed. "Don't thank me yet. We've got 14 feet to go." Word moved through Red Spur slowly, the way true things tend to. By the second week, others had started appearing at the dig site. The blacksmith came with proper drilling equipment and the knowledge of how to set charges in rock without killing everyone present. Two of the younger freight hands came on their days off. Then an older farmer named Prescott, who had worked beside Callum through the lean months of the drought and apparently had his own opinions about debt and redemption. Dora Vance arrived on the 12th day with a wagon full of food and bandages and a look on her face that discouraged comment. They worked in shifts, most of them, because they had jobs and families and the responsibilities of their own lives. But they came when they could, and Callum was there every morning before any of them, and still there every evening after the last of them had gone working by lamplight until his arms gave out and then sleeping 4 hours and starting again. He did not do this to be observed. He did it because there was nothing else to do. The work was the thing. Not the result, not the redemption, not the story he might eventually be able to tell. The work itself, the contact between effort and earth, was the only honest language available to him, and he intended to speak it until he ran out of things to say. The excavation reached 12 feet, 15. The stone at this depth was different, darker, with veins of mineral color running through it that the blacksmith said were promising, encouraging. There was water table evidence in the crystalline structure if you knew where to look. Callum kept swinging. The days had a particular quality that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The cold air, the ring of metal on stone, the shared labor of men who had every reason to resent him and had chosen for reasons that remained their own private business to show up anyway. The mountains watching from their permanent distance, indifferent and old and absolute. He thought about Mei every day. Not continuously, not with the obsessive repetition of a desperate man, but with the steady background awareness of a man who knows where he is trying to get to. He thought about the way she had stood in that doorway and asked him whether he had ever been real. He thought about the specific weight of that question, which was not the same as asking whether he was a good person or a bad one. It was asking whether anything they had built together was built on actual ground or on nothing. He intended to find out, not by answering the question with words which he had forfeited the right to deploy for that purpose, but by doing the only thing he could do with any integrity work. On the morning of the 21st day, he was alone in the excavation, the others not yet arrived, when the pickaxe hit something different. Not granite, not packed earth, something with a different quality of resistance, a texture that was almost soft by comparison, that yielded rather than refused. He struck again, harder. The blade sank 2 inches instead of the usual 1/4 inch. He felt it before he saw it, a change in the air at the bottom of the pit, a faint coolness rising where there had been only the warmth of enclosed earth. He dropped to his knees and dug with his hands, pulling loose soil and small stones following the direction the dampness came from, and the seepage began almost immediately. A trickle, then a steady dark thread of water. Then, as he widened the opening with his bare hands and the pickaxe aflow, then the spring erupted. It came up cold and clear. and with the force of something that has been held underground for decades, waiting for someone to be stubborn enough to find it. It hit Callum in the chest and soaked him to the skin in approximately 4 seconds, and he sat in the bottom of the pit with water rising around him and started laughing. Exhausted, disbelieving laughter that echoed off the stone walls and had no audience but the Wyoming sky above. He shouted for Doyle. Within 10 minutes, the pit was full of people, and the pulley system was rigged to start moving water to the surface, and someone was already running for town. The spring flowed with a constancy that suggested permanence. The blacksmith tested the pressure and said it was enough for a town 3 times Red Spur's size. Dora Vance appeared at the edge of the pit and looked down at Callum, soaking wet and grinning with mud on his face. "You actually did it," she said. "We did it," he said. That night, Red Spur celebrated with a generosity born of relief. Tables appeared in the square. The fiddle player came out again. People who had been carrying the particular tension of water scarcity for months let it down in laughter and noise, and the shared warmth of a community that had survived something difficult together. Callum stood at the edge of the celebration in clean clothes, borrowed again from Hank Doyle, and he stayed at the edge because this victory was not his to claim. He had dug the spring, yes, but the spring existed for Mei, and Mei had not come. He was searching the shadows when a voice came from behind him. Looking for someone, he turned. Mei stood a few feet away, holding something. The dented tin cup, he realized. She had carried it here. The firelight from the celebration fell across her face, and he could see that she had been thinking. That the weeks of his absence had been occupied with something more than simple anger. Her expression was not warm yet, but it was not what it had been that last day in the square either. It was the expression of a woman who has asked herself every question she could think of, and arrived at a place that was neither answer nor surrender, but something more honest than both. She walked toward him slowly and stopped 4 feet away. "Mrs. Vance told me what you did," she said. "How long you worked. How deep the dig went." Callum didn't speak. "She said your hands may not fully heal. The doctor isn't certain." "They'll heal." Mei looked at him steadily. "Why, you have money. You could have hired 20 men. Could have bought drilling equipment. Could have had this done in a week." "The easy way would have been another lie," Callum said. "And I'm done lying to you." She was quiet for a moment. In the background, the fiddle started up again. "Who are you?" she asked. "Really?" Callum took a breath. "My name is Callum Rourke. I own the largest cattle operation in the Wyoming Territory and portions of 2 territories adjacent. I have more money than I know what to do with and more land than I can ride across in a week." He paused. "And none of it ever made me feel as real as carrying your laundry basket to the porch rail." Mei looked down at the tin cup in her hands. "I came to Red Spur to find out if anyone could see me," Callum said, "without the money and the power telling them who I was. And you did. You gave water to a stranger who had nothing and asked for nothing back. You saw Cole Marsh nobody and treated him with more dignity than anyone ever showed Callum Rourke." "So it was a test," she said quietly. "No." The word came out sharp and certain. "It was a hope, and then it became the most real thing in my life." She was quiet. The celebration continued around them. "You should have told me," she said finally. "I know. I trusted you. I know. And I broke that trust. I can't undo it." He met her eyes. "But I can show you, not with words, that the man who helped you, who fixed your roof and left firewood and dug through 20 feet of granite, that man was real. The only thing false was the name." The silence between them stretched for a long time. Somewhere behind them, someone was laughing too loudly and the fiddle hit a wrong note and corrected itself. Mei looked at the spring water flowing in its new channel across the square. "The spring will save this town," she said. "It will. People are calling it a miracle. It's just water." She shook her head very slightly. "It's proof that you meant what you said, that Cole Marsh wasn't entirely a disguise." She held the cup out toward him. "You look thirsty." The same words, the same cup, the gesture that had begun everything. Callum stared at the cup for a moment. Then she walked to the newly running well, filled it from the spring water that was flowing there for the first time, and brought it back and held it out again. He took it. His hands were shaking. The water was cold and clear and tasted like something he did not have a name for. When he lowered the cup, she was still there, still watching him with those clear, steady eyes. "I'm not ready to forgive you completely," she said quietly. "Not yet. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single evening." "I know, but I believe you're trying to earn it back." She paused. "And that matters." He nodded, not trusting his voice. The man who dug that spring, she said. That's the man I want to know. Not Callum Rourke, not Cole Marsh. Just the man willing to work for what matters. That's who I'm trying to be. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight and noise. Then she turned back toward the celebration, then paused and said without looking back, the man who dug that spring, he can walk me home tonight if he wants. And Callum Rourke, the richest man in the Western Territories, stood in the mud of a frontier square with a dented tin cup in his damaged hands and felt possibility move through him like water through stone, slow and patient and absolutely certain of where it was going. The walk home was quiet, which was the right thing for it to be. Red Spur's celebration continued behind them, the fiddle and the laughter fading as they moved through streets that were dark and empty at this hour, the lamplight from the saloon casting long shadows that shortened and disappeared around the corner. Callum walked beside Mei, the way a man walks when he is not certain of his welcome, not quite close enough to claim it, not quite distant enough to surrender it. She did not speak. He did not speak. The night was cold and clear, the kind of winter cold that came with total sky and every star visible, and their breath rose together in small white clouds. At the laundry door, she stopped and turned. "Good night, Cole," she said, and then corrected herself immediately, a small catch in the correction. "Callum, Cole is fine," he said, "if you'd rather." She considered this. "No," she said finally. "I think I'd rather know your real name, even if it needs some getting used to." She went inside. Callum walked back to the boarding house, which had not extended its welcome back to him yet, but had given him the room at the end of the hall on a week-to-week basis at Dora Vance's particular discretion. And he sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long time, looking at the ceiling and understanding that what had happened tonight was not a resolution. It was a beginning of something more difficult than anything that had come before, which was the work of proving yourself over time to someone who had every reasonable justification for not believing you. He understood that. He accepted it. He was back at the freight yard before dawn. The town's relationship with him did not transform overnight because nothing in Red Spur operated overnight except necessity and emergencies. But it shifted incrementally the way temperature shifts in early spring, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with a momentum that began to feel inevitable. Hank Doyle called him Elias for 3 days before switching to Callum, the name arriving in Doyle's mouth without ceremony or announcement, as though it had always been there and just needed to be located. Dora Vance stopped calling him Mr. Rourke and started calling him nothing at all, which was its own kind of progress. The younger workers were faster to adjust. A 17-year-old named Danny, who had worked in the freight yard since he was 14, started drifting into Callum's orbit within a week, drawn by the particular curiosity of young men toward men who have done things they don't fully understand. "Mr. Doyle says you really dug that whole spring yourself," Danny said one afternoon, heaving a grain sack alongside Callum. "To start, I mean." "The first week was alone," Callum said. "After that, I had help." "But you started it alone, without any—" Danny paused, apparently working out how to phrase this without offense. "Without using what you had." "Yes." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Callum thought about Mei's face, about the way she had asked him whether he had ever been real, about the specific question that had no answer in money or power, or any of the resources he had spent 20 years accumulating. "Because some things can't be bought," he said. "They have to be earned." Danny nodded slowly, working this over. They finished the wagon in silence, but it was the comfortable silence of people who have shared something that doesn't require amplification. The conversations with Mei resumed at the pace she set, which was measured and careful and entirely her own. She didn't seek him out, didn't manufacture reasons to cross paths. But when their paths crossed naturally, which they did regularly, in a town the size of Red Spur, she stopped avoiding his eyes. They talked about the laundry, about the spring's impact on her business, about the steady return of customers who had been washing less frequently during the worst of the drought. They talked about her father, Mei Shen, who had improved considerably since the water pressure normalized and the household work became easier. They did not talk about the past. Until one evening when they did. Callum was passing the laundry at the end of a long day. His second week back, when he found a wooden post in the clothesline structure, had snapped at the base, taking a section of the line down and with it, and dumping a load of clean sheets into the dirt. Mei was standing over the damage with the expression of a person absorbing a blow they have no energy left to fight. "Need help?" Callum asked. She looked at him. He saw the old reflex move across her face, the impulse toward refusal, the pride that had been her most consistent companion through years of difficulty. Then she let it go. "The post has rotted through," she said. I need to replace it. I can fix it. Won't take long. I can't pay you. I'm not asking for payment. She studied him the way she always studied him now, looking for the thing behind the offer that wasn't there, the transaction hidden in the generosity. He waited while she looked and found nothing. All right, she said. He borrowed tools from the blacksmith and spent 2 hours replacing not just the broken post, but reinforcing the entire clothesline structure, checking every joint and connection, taking the kind of care that turned a repair into something better than what had been there before. Mei watched him work from the porch, and he was aware of her watching, and he worked with the particular deliberateness of a man who knows he is being assessed and has nothing to hide and everything to prove. When he finished, she disappeared inside and returned with a small cloth bundle. Rice, vegetables, a portion of fish. You missed dinner working on this, she said. He took the bundle carefully. The same meal she had given him months ago when he was Cole Marsh and the world had been simpler. He understood the weight of the gesture, the acknowledgement encoded in the repetition of it. Thank you, he said. She nodded. He turned to go. Callum. He stopped. When you came here, she said, what did you expect to find? He turned back. She was standing in the lamplight from the door, arms folded slightly. Her expression, that particular combination of directness and care that was entirely her own. I expected to be invisible, he said, to find out what people were really like when they didn't know who they were dealing with. And what did you find? He looked at her for a moment. I found that kindness exists outside of obligation, that some people give it freely for no reason except that it's the right thing to do. He paused. I hadn't believed that before I came here. She was quiet. I found that honest work has a different quality than work done by proxy, he said. That something builds in your body and your character when you do things yourself that doesn't build any other way. He met her eyes. And I found that I had been so busy protecting myself from being seen falsely that I had stopped letting myself be seen at all. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, good night, Callum, and went inside. He walked back to the boarding house slowly, and he felt not hope exactly, but the ground firming up beneath something that had been standing on unstable footing for a long time. The spring brought changes to Red Spur that nobody had predicted. Water security translated to possibility. In ways that compounded quickly, new families arrived. A second general store was discussed. The schoolhouse conversation moved from aspiration to planning. The town was growing, and growth, Callum understood from long experience, always brought complications. The complications arrived in March in the form of Dent and Frey. Frey had not been idle since the anonymous purchase of the laundry building had disrupted his first attempt at expansion. He had been reconsidering, recalibrating, doing the math of a changing town and arriving at new conclusions about how to extract value from it. He began buying properties, not just the laundry this time, but broadly the old widow's house on the north end of the street, the Johnson homestead, a section of farming land adjacent to the irrigation channels the spring had made possible. He made offers that were technically generous and practically coercive, backed by implications about what might happen to property values and access to services if the town's development proceeded in directions that didn't favor the holdouts. Callum heard about it in the freight yard as he heard about most things. The town talked to itself constantly, and he had become someone the town talked around as though he were part of the landscape. Frey's offering the Johnsons $300 for their place, Danny said. Says if they don't take it, he'll have their irrigation access reviewed. Can he do that? Nobody knows for certain, said the older freight hand across from them. That's how he makes it work. Callum set down the board he was carrying. He knew Frey. Not personally, but he knew the species had done business with a dozen variations of the same man over 20 years, someone who had learned to use the machinery of wealth and law to extract value from people who didn't understand they had options. He had been that kind of man himself in his earlier years. He had been less direct about it, more sophisticated in his methods, but the underlying transaction had been the same, taking advantage of a power differential and calling it commerce. He knew exactly how to fight it. But fighting it as Callum Rourke, using his connections and resources and the weight of his name in the territorial business community, would confirm everything the people of Red Spur had feared when they learned who he was, that he was a man who solved problems by deploying advantages they didn't have, who stood with them only as long as it served his purposes, who ultimately saw himself as operating on a different plane. He needed to find a way to help that gave the town its own tools rather than solving the problem with his. He found his answer in a conversation with Mei. She had heard about Frey's offer on the laundry building, the first one before the anonymous purchase intervened. She had been thinking about it ever since. The problem, she said on an afternoon when they were walking the perimeter of the square while her father rested, is that Frey works on isolation. He approaches people one at a time where they're alone and uncertain, makes each person feel like the only one facing the decision. Yes, Callum said, but if everyone facing the same decision knew about each other, he can't pressure a coalition the way he can pressure individuals. She stopped walking and looked at him. You've seen this before. I've been on both sides of it, he said honestly. She absorbed this without flinching. Then you know how to fight it. I know someone who does it better than I do. He thought of Mei Shen, the land rights lawyer he had worked with 3 years ago, a woman whose particular hatred for the Frey species of operator had been refined to a cutting edge through years of practice. A lawyer. She specializes in exactly this kind of situation. I can contact her. Using your connections. Yes, but as a resource I'm making available to you, not as something I'm controlling. He looked at her. The strategy stays with the town. The decisions stay with the people involved. I'm just providing access to expertise you might not otherwise have. Mei considered this carefully the way she considered everything, turning it over to find the angles. That's a meaningful distinction, she said finally, but you'd have to trust us to use it without interference. I'd have to, he agreed. Can you trust me to stay in my lane? A small thing moved across her face that might have been the beginning of something warmer. I think, she said, that we're both still finding out what we can trust. The town meeting happened 3 days later. Nearly 40 people crowded into the saloon, more than Callum had ever seen in one place in Red Spur, people who had been approached by Frey and people who expected to be. Hank Doyle called the meeting to order with the particular authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. Callum sat near the back and listened. That was what he had promised himself he would do. But when the room started cycling toward despair, toward the particular inertia that came from people who believed themselves outmatched, he stood up. He's got money and lawyers, someone had said. What do we have? Each other, Callum said. The room turned, and the same legal system he's using if we know how to use it. Old man Prescott from the general store squinted at him. Easy for you to say. You're Callum Rourke. What do the rest of us have? Right now, my offer to contact a lawyer who knows this territory's land law better than Frey's lawyers do. She costs money, I'll pay for that. He paused. But the strategy is yours. She advises you decide. I'm not running this. Murmurs moved through the room. Why would you do that? Said Martha Johnson from the third row. What do you get from it? Callum looked at her. He looked at Mei, who was standing against the side wall watching him. Honestly, he said, nothing material, but I'm learning that some things matter more than what I can get out of them. A long silence. Hank Doyle looked around the room. Show of hands. Who wants to try this? Refuse Frey's offers. Document everything. Let the lawyer advise on the legal angles. The hands went up. Not all of them, because fear was a reasonable response to what they were facing, but enough. Mei's hand was among the first. Callum caught her eye across the room and saw something in her expression that he had not seen there before, or perhaps had seen without knowing what it was. Something that looked like the beginning of genuine confidence. Not in him exactly, in the thing they were trying to build together. He sat back down and let the meeting continue without him. Mei Shen arrived in Red Spur 10 days later with 2 assistants and a leather case full of documents, in the particular energy of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem to appear. She was in her 40s with a manner that combined academic precision with the practical toughness of someone who had argued in frontier courtrooms for 2 decades, and she looked at Frey's operation with the expression of a chess player who has seen this opening before and knows exactly where it leads. He's using 4 distinct strategies, she told the coalition at their first meeting, spreading documents across Dorovance's dining table. Isolation, implied threat, artificial urgency, and what I'd call legal ambiguity theater. He makes references to permits and reviews and access agreements that may or may not actually affect your properties, knowing most of you won't verify before the deadline he set. What do we do? Prescott asked. First, you verify. Secondly, you document every interaction you have with Frey or his representatives. Every conversation, every letter, every implied threat. She looked around the table. And third, you refuse to be isolated. The moment anyone receives an offer or a pressure tactic, you tell everyone in this room within the day. The coalition held, barely sometimes in the way that things under pressure hold, with visible strain and the constant awareness that any single failure could cascade. But they held. When Frey had the water supply to Old Man Prescott's property, mysteriously interrupted. 4 men from the coalition were there to photograph the damaged pipe connections within 2 hours, and Margaret filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Water Authority before nightfall. When he approached the Johnsons with an offer that included an implied reference to their children's safety, 2 witnesses from the coalition were present, having quietly inserted themselves into the meeting at the Johnsons' request, and Margaret filed an additional complaint that named the specific legal statutes involved. Callum did none of this himself. He hauled freight, he helped repair buildings, he attended the coalition meetings and said very little, offering logistical observations when asked and staying quiet when not asked. He had promised himself in May that this was their fight to lead, and he kept the promise, and it cost him considerable effort to keep it because he could see opportunities and strategies that would have accelerated everything. But some kinds of help could only be given at the expense of something more important. He was splitting wood behind the boarding house one evening when May appeared, her arms wrapped against the cold, her father's health having become a routine check in their daily conversations. "Frey sent a message to Margaret today," she said. Callum set the axe down. "What kind?" "He wants to talk." "Directly. No lawyers." She watched him. Margaret thinks it's a trap, but she also thinks it might mean he's starting to worry about the legal exposure. "He should be worried," Callum said. "Margaret doesn't lose these." "She said the same thing about you." May tilted her head slightly. "She said you've changed, that the Callum Rourke she knew would have bought the whole town and solved this himself." "He would have." "Is that person still in there?" Callum picked up the axe and set another log. "He's in there," he said honestly. "He'll probably always be in there. The difference is that I understand now what he takes from people when he solves their problems for them." He swung the wood splitting cleanly. "He takes their agency, their chance to discover they're capable." He set the two halves aside. "You were capable of this without me. You needed access to resources, not someone to swoop in and rescue you." May was quiet for a moment. "You really believe that?" "I know it." He met her eyes. "You organized that meeting. You identified the coalition strategy before I said a word about it. You saw the thing I saw, and you got there without me." She looked at him steadily, and he saw the thing happening behind her eyes that he had learned to watch for, the careful, deliberate lowering of a guard that had been in place for very good reasons. "My father wants to see you," she said. "Tomorrow evening if you're free." Callum looked at her. "He's been asking about you," she said simply. "He says a man worth knowing is worth knowing properly." The visit happened the following evening in the laundry's back room where Mei Shen spent most of his time. Now his health improved but not fully recovered from the pneumonia that had threatened him in the hard winter months. The old man had a particular kind of stillness that Callum recognized as the stillness of someone who had survived things and had the patience that came from survival, a refusal to be rushed by anything that could be waited out. Mei Shen studied Callum with sharp dark eyes and said in careful accented English, "My daughter tells me you are the man who dug our spring." "I was part of a crew," Callum said. "She says you started alone, that you worked for weeks before anyone found you." "That's accurate." The old man considered this. "She also tells me you are wealthy, very wealthy." "Yes, sir." "And that you lied about your name and your circumstances for many months." "Yes, sir." "And that since the lie was discovered, you have worked in the freight yard and lived in the boarding house and spent your own money on legal help for this town's defense." "Yes, sir." Mei Shen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have known 2 kinds of wealthy men. The first kind believes that money makes him correct. Every decision he makes is right because he made it, and any failure is someone else's fault." He paused. "The second kind learns that money is a tool, not a credential. That having it does not make you wise. That using it to take over other people's problems is sometimes the worst thing you can do to them." Callum waited. "I spent 30 years being dismissed by the first kind," Mei said. "I spent 30 years learning to recognize the second kind because they are rare and they are worth knowing." He looked at Callum with the directness of a very old and very tired man who no longer has the patience for anything except the truth. "Which kind are you becoming?" "I'm trying," Callum said, "to be the second kind." The old man nodded slowly. "Trying is honest," he said. "Better than claiming." He gestured toward the chair beside him. "Sit. Tell me about your cattle operation. I have always wanted to know how irrigation works in dry territory." They talked for 2 hours long past the time Callum had expected to stay while May moved through the laundry doing the last work of the day and occasionally looked in through the doorway with an expression that Callum could not read but felt was significant. When he finally rose to leave, Wei Shen shook his hand with a grip that was still firm despite everything and said, "Come back." "I will," Callum said, and meant it. Outside, Mei walked him to the street. "He doesn't often tell strangers to come back," she said. "I got the sense he doesn't say things he doesn't mean." "Never." A pause. "He's a good judge of people." Callum looked at her in the lamplight from the laundry window. This woman who had given him water and started something he still didn't have the proper words for. And what does his daughter judge? The question hung between them for a moment longer than a simple question needed to. "His daughter," Mei said quietly, "is still working on it." She held his gaze for one steady moment. But she's starting to think the answer might be something worth finding out. She went inside. Callum walked back through the quiet streets of Red Spur, past the spring's new channels, past the buildings whose futures were being fought for, past all of it, and felt something inside him that had been clenched for a long time, beginning very cautiously, very slowly to open. March ended without resolution, which was how legal battles of this kind tended to end their first chapters, not with victory or defeat, but with the slow accumulation of evidence and documentation that Margaret Chen called building the record. Frey's pressure tactics continued recalibrated towards subtlety, as his lawyers evidently cautioned him about the complaints already filed. He moved through Red Spur, like weather now present in the way that an approaching storm is present, felt before it arrived, influencing decisions by its possibility. The coalition held. Callum worked. The weeks had found a rhythm that was in its bones, exactly what he had come looking for when he rode east 6 months ago. Early mornings in the freight yard, the particular satisfaction of physical work that left him genuinely tired rather than merely hollow. Evenings sometimes at the Shen laundry, the conversations with Mei growing longer and more honest, with each passing week ranging from the mundane details of daily life in Red Spur to the larger questions that a man and a woman circle around each other for months before they dare approach directly. He knew, and he believed she knew, that something was building between them. The acknowledgement of it was the thing that hadn't happened yet. They had come close several times, had stood at the edge of it, and then retreated to safer ground, not because either of them was afraid of the thing itself, but because the timing of it mattered, because trust rebuilt on its own schedule and not on the schedule of desire, and both of them understood this clearly enough to honor it. Then Wei Shen's health failed. It started as a cough in early April. The kind of spring cough that settled in old chests, and sometimes it resolved itself and sometimes did not. Callum noticed the change in Mei's manner before he knew the cause, a new tightness around her eyes, a distraction that interrupted her sentences in ways that were unlike her. She was carrying something heavier than usual, and carrying it alone in the way she carried everything she could not put down. He asked directly. She told him. "The doctor says it's pneumonia," she said one morning, standing in the laundry doorway with her arms folded in a way that meant she was working not to let the fear show. "He's been coughing for a week. The fever started 3 days ago." "How serious?" "At his age." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Serious. What does he need?" "There's a medicine, a tincture imported from San Francisco. It might help, the doctor says. The nearest supply is in Cheyenne, 3 days hard ride." "How much does it cost?" She told him. It was more than the laundry made in 3 months. He watched her absorb the number, the way she absorbed everything difficult without collapse, with the particular dignity of someone who has learned to keep standing even when what they're being asked to stand through is unreasonable. "I'll find a way," she said. "Mei." He stepped closer. "Let me go." She looked at him. "Cheyenne is 3 days. 2 if I push hard." He met her eyes. "I have the money, I have a fast horse, and I know these trails." He paused. "Let me do this. Please." The old reflex moved across her face. The independence that had kept her alive through hard years, the refusal to be beholden, the pride that was also armor. He watched her fight it. "This isn't a transaction," he said quietly. "This isn't about anything between you and me. It's about your father and the medicine he needs. Let me help." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were bright with something she was keeping in by will. "Go," she said. "Please, hurry." He was saddled and out of Red Spur before the sun had finished rising. He pushed his horse through the long morning and into the afternoon with the kind of focused urgency that came from having a clear purpose for the first time in years. Not complicated urgency, not the urgency of profit or competition or the 100 transactional imperatives that had once populated his days. Just, there is medicine in Cheyenne, and there is a man in Red Spur who needs it, and the distance between them needs to close as fast as possible. He stopped to water his horse at every creek, knowing that the animal's endurance was the ceiling on his own speed. He ate in the saddle, barely tasting it. He pressed through the mountain pass in late afternoon, where the trail narrowed and the drop to one side was long enough to kill a horse and rider, both moving carefully but not stopping. He had contacts at a ranch 40 miles from Cheyenne. He arrived at nightfall, exchanged his own horse for a fresh one with the directness of a man who owned ranches and knew exactly what a favor was worth, and pushed on through the dark. The stars were out by the time the lights of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon, close enough to be real, but still an hour's hard riding away. His body had moved past the ordinary vocabulary of aches and complaints and arrived at the deeper territory of pure function, where the mind simply ran what needed running without comment. The medical supply house was dark when he arrived. He found the proprietor's residence behind it and knocked until lights came on. The proprietor, a small, careful man named Aldous, opened the door with the expression of someone who has been woken by demanding men before and has learned to assess them quickly. "Pneumonia medicine," Callum said. "The imported tincture from San Francisco. Whatever you have." Aldous looked at him, at the state of him which was the state of a man who had been riding hard for a day and a half without pause. "I have 3 bottles," Aldous said. "That's a week's treatment for a typical case." "I'll take all 3. The price was higher than the doctor had estimated. Callum didn't negotiate. He counted the money from his riding coat, the bills dark-edged with trail dust and sweat, and Aldous wrapped the bottles with the methodical care of a man who understood that this particular package needed to survive its journey. "You're injured," Aldous said, looking at Callum's hands. "The medicine," Callum said. He was back on the horse before Aldous finished telling him to be careful. The return journey was worse. He was running on something that had gone beyond exhaustion into a kind of reduced essential state where only the necessary remained. The mountains at night were different from the mountains in daylight, more absolute, less forgiving, the trails visible only by moonlight and memory. His horse, fresher than he was, wanted to slow on the descents. He let it slow enough to be safe, but only that much. He thought about Mei to stay awake, about the way she had looked when she told him about her father, about the trust she had placed in him, tentative and careful and real, and how it was the most valuable thing anyone had given him in 20 years. About the possibility that was growing between them, which required Mei Shen to be alive. He rode through the second night. He pulled into Red Spur 37 hours after leaving both horses spent his own body a map of accumulated damage. He fell off his horse in front of the laundry rather than dismounting, caught himself against the post and knocked on the door before he had time to reconsider anything. It opened before he finished knocking. Mei stood in the doorway and he could see in her face that the night had been difficult, the specific exhaustion of someone who has kept vigil and doesn't know the outcome yet. Her eyes took in the state of him and widened. "I got it," he said, and fumbled with the saddlebag. His hands weren't cooperating properly. She stepped down off the porch and helped him with the bag, and when she pulled out the wrapped bottles, her hands shook. She read the labels and her eyes closed for a moment. "You actually got it," she said quietly. "Is he still alive?" "Barely, but alive. The fever hasn't broken." She looked at him. "Callum, how long have you been riding?" "Doesn't matter." "How long?" 37 hours. She said nothing for a moment, then, "Get inside, right now." Dr. Harrison arrived within minutes, summoned by one of the laundry's neighbors who had been keeping watch. He administered the first dose to Mei Shen while Callum sat in the front room, too tired to stand watching the lamplight move across the walls. The doctor came back out and looked at Callum with professional assessment. "You're severely dehydrated. You need to stay off that horse for at least 3 days." "I have freight." "Mr. Doyle has been informed," Mei said from behind Harrison. "Sit still." He sat still. She brought water and he drank it, and she brought more and he drank that too. The room had the quality of extreme fatigue, slightly unreal. The edges of things not quite sharp. He was aware of her moving around him with the efficient care of someone who has tended sick people before bringing water, checking the wrap on his hands, where the old wounds had opened again in the riding, bringing food that he ate without tasting. At some point, she sat down across from him. "Why?" she asked. "You know why. Tell me anyway." He looked at her across the small table. "Because your father matters to you. Because you've been carrying things alone for long enough. Because," he stopped, tried to find the specific word for what the next thing was. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch him suffer when I had the means to help. There's a difference between using money to control people and using it to save them. I'm still learning that difference, but I know it exists." Mei was quiet. In the back room, Mei Shen's breathing was audible through the wall, labored but present. You could have died in those mountains, she said. I didn't. You could have. The chance was worth it. She looked at him for a long moment, and in her face he saw the war being waged, the careful accounting of a woman who had learned not to trust too quickly and too completely, because the cost of trusting wrong was more than she could afford again. He could see her working through it, weighing the history of the past months against the possibility of the months ahead. Sleep, she said finally. Please, you can barely keep your eyes open. She guided him to the cot in the spare room, and he was asleep before she left the doorway. He woke to rain on the roof. The room was unfamiliar for 3 seconds before he placed himself. The laundry spare room, lamplight under the door. Quiet. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rain, feeling the inventory of his body's complaints. And then he got up and went to find Mei. She was in the front room with a cup of tea sitting near the window watching the rain. The lines of exhaustion in her face had softened somewhat, which meant she had slept. Your father? He asked. Her face transformed. The fever broke an hour ago. Dr. Harrison was here. He says the medicine is working. She looked at Callum, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, but was in the neighborhood. He's going to recover. Callum sat down across from her and let the relief come through him like heat. My father wants to see you, she said. When you're arrested, he knows what you did. He didn't need to know. He asked. I told him the truth. She held his gaze. He wants to speak with you directly. The visit to Mei Shen's bedside happened that afternoon. The old man was weak, propped against pillows, but his eyes were clear, and the particular acuity that was characteristic of him was entirely present. He studied Callum for a long moment before speaking. My daughter told me you rode through a mountain pass at night, he said. The trail was clear enough. She told me you arrived unable to stand properly. That's somewhat overstated. The old man made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been assessment. I have known rich men all my life, Mr. Rourke. They did not ride through mountain passes in the dark for the fathers of laundry women. Callum said nothing. Do you love my daughter? Mei Shen asked. The directness of it was familiar, the same quality Mei had the refusal to orbit a question when the direct path was available. Yes, Callum said, I do. She is not simple, Mei said. She is not someone who will be comfortable as an ornament or an arrangement. She has opinions, strong ones. She will disagree with you. I know. She has been hurt before. Not in the way you are thinking, but the world has not been consistently kind to her, and she has built herself strong because it had to be done. The old man's eyes were steady on him. If you hurt her again, I won't. You cannot promise that. No one can. Then I promise to try with everything I have not to. Callum held the old man's gaze. And if I fail, I promise to be honest about it and spend whatever it takes to make it right. That's the only promise that's actually worth anything. Mei Shen studied him in the lamp's quiet light. That answer, he said, is better than the previous answer would have been. He held out his hand. Callum took it. The grip was still firm. My daughter tells me you are learning, Mei said, that the man you are becoming is different from the man you were. He paused. I am old enough to know that this kind of change is the most difficult thing a person can do, and the most important. He released Callum's hand. Come back tomorrow. I want to hear about the spring, how you found it, what made you keep digging. That evening, Callum was helping Mei carry fresh linens from the drying line when she stopped in the middle of the courtyard and looked at the sky. The rain had passed. The last of the April light was copper and long on the mountains. I owe you an apology, she said. He looked at her surprised. When your identity was revealed, she said, I closed the door. I didn't let you explain. I reacted from hurt, which was understandable, but she pressed her lips together. I also made a judgment that assumed the worst about why you had done it, that you were playing with us, experimenting on us like specimens. That was a reasonable conclusion. It was a lazy one, she said firmly. I knew you. I had watched you work for months. I had seen you fix my roof and carry my water and leave firewood before dawn. And I let one revelation erase all of that because it was easier than sitting with the complexity. She looked at him. That wasn't fair to you. He was quiet for a moment. You had every right to be angry. I had the right to be angry about the lie. I didn't have the right to decide that the lie was all there was. She picked up the linens she had set down. I'm saying I'm sorry for the part that was my error. You already know the part that was yours. Callum looked at her. The lamp in the laundry window made a warm square of light on the courtyard's packed earth, and in it, Mei Shen stood holding a stack of clean linens and holding his gaze with the steadiness that was the most distinctly her thing in the world. I think, he said carefully, that we're becoming people who can trust each other. I think so too, she said. It's slower than I expected. Slower is better, she almost smiled. In some respects, the fray matter broke in the first week of May. Margaret Shen had been assembling the record for 6 weeks, and the record had accumulated a specificity that went far beyond what she had originally expected to find. What had begun as a land grab operation in Red Spur turned out to be the local instance of a pattern that stretched across 3 territories. Frey had been running versions of the same scheme for a decade using shell companies and borrowed legal language in the particular vulnerability of frontier settlements that lacked access to sophisticated legal representation. The territorial governor's office took the complaint seriously. An investigator arrived in Red Spur with a sealed warrant and a staff lawyer and spent 4 days reviewing documents with Margaret before writing to confront Frey directly. The arrest happened on a Thursday afternoon. Callum was in the freight yard when word came. He put down the grain sack he was carrying and walked to the square and saw Frey being escorted to a horse by 2 men with territorial authority badges. His expensive coat and his calculated smile both somehow diminished in the spring sunlight. Frey looked across the square as he passed and found Callum's face. "Rourke," he said, "you behind this?" "The coalition behind this," Callum said. "I just provided access to a good lawyer." Frey's expression said he understood the distinction less than Callum did. He was guided onto his horse and ridden out of Red Spur, and the square watched him go, with the particular silence of people who have been living under something and are only now fully registering its removal. Then the celebration broke through, and it was the celebration of people who had done it themselves, which was the best kind. Callum stood at the edge of the square and watched it, and felt the satisfaction of someone who has kept a promise to himself. He had stood with the town. He had not taken over. And Red Spur had won its own fight, which was what he had wanted for it. May appeared beside him. "Margaret says the case against Frey will affect his operations across all 3 territories, she said. That the people he's displaced in the other towns will have legal recourse. It should never have gotten this far," Callum said. "Men like Frey operate for years before anyone stops them, because the people they target don't have access to the resources needed to fight back. Is that going to change?" He looked at her. "Not everywhere, but Margaret is setting up a practice in Cheyenne that specifically serves frontier settlements. She won't have to do it for free. I've made arrangements." Mai was quiet for a moment, without telling anyone. "It's not about anyone knowing. It's about the problem getting fixed." He paused. "Is that still crossing the line?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "I think that's actually the difference. You didn't solve our problem for us. You solved the systemic problem that creates the conditions where the problem arises." She looked at him. "That's different. I'm still learning the distinctions. So am I." She turned to face him fully. "Callum, I need to tell you something." He waited. "When you were in Cheyenne," she said, "when you were gone and I didn't know if you'd make it back, I understood something I had been avoiding understanding." She held his gaze with the steadiness that was hers. "I understood that I had stopped protecting myself from being hurt by you and started hoping that you wouldn't be." She paused. "That's a different thing." The celebration behind them was reaching its natural peak, and in a few minutes it would begin to wind down and all the ordinary things would reassert themselves and this moment would have passed. He understood that clearly. "May," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what I feel. I'm telling you that I know." They stood together in the spring light with the town celebrating behind them. And after a moment she took a step closer and he did not move away, and they stood that close together, watching the square and not needing to say anything more. Not yet. But the distance between yet and now had become, without either of them quite deciding it, very small. The letter from Thomas arrived in late May, carried by a rider who had been 3 days on the trail and was dusty enough to show it. Callum was in the Freyard yard when it came, and he read it leaning against a post in the afternoon sun, with the particular feeling of a man who has been expecting something and still isn't quite prepared for it when it arrives. The letter was precise and professional, as Thomas always was. There were matters requiring his attention at the ranch, a water rights dispute with a neighboring operation that had escalated to a formal hearing. The Board of Investors was requesting an extraordinary meeting. Several long-standing contracts were up for renewal and required decisions that only Callum could authorize. The estate had been managed excellently in his absence, Thomas noted, and would continue to be managed excellently, but the decisions themselves had accumulated to a point where absence was no longer a viable position. Callum folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He sat with it through the rest of the workday, through the evening walk to the laundry, through the dinner that May had started leaving for him on days when the work ran late. He sat with it in the same way he sat with difficult things, not rushing toward resolution, letting the discomfort of it be present without trying to solve it prematurely. He told May that evening. She was mending a shirt by the lamp, and she set it down when he finished, and she looked at him with the expression that he had learned to recognize as her truest one, the one that didn't perform anything but simply responded to what was actually in front of her. "You have to go," she said. "I do." She absorbed this. For how long? "I don't know exactly. A few weeks, maybe longer, depending on the hearing." He watched her. "I'll come back." The words fell into the space between them with a particular weight because he had said this before and she had carried this particular fear before, and both of them understood that. "The question," she said quietly, "isn't whether you'll come back. The question is whether you'll come back as who you are now or as someone else." "What do you mean?" She looked at him steadily. "Going back to that world, Callum. The mansion, the business, the meetings, the people who see Callum Rourke and calculate what he's worth to them. You've been away from it for 7 months. It was your entire life for 20 years. She paused. "I need to know if the person I'm trusting is real or if he only exists in Red Spur." The question was the exact right question, and he had known it was coming. Had been asking it himself in quieter moments, had been trying to find an answer that wasn't just optimistic noise. "Come with me," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Come with me to the ranch. I want you to see it. I want you to see the person I am there and decide for yourself whether he's someone you recognize." He met her eyes. "You shouldn't have to take my word for who I am anywhere. You've earned the right to witness it directly." The surprise in her face moved through several stages before settling somewhere thoughtful. "My father is considerably improved. Dr. Harrison said last week he's largely recovered." Callum watched her. "I know what I'm asking. It's a long way. It's a different world. And I know you have a business and a father and a life here. I'm not asking you to leave any of that. I'm asking if you'll come and look and then tell me what you see." She was quiet for a long time. "My father would have to come," she said finally. "Of course. And I want to be back by the end of June. There's a large washing order coming in from the new families." "Before the end of June." She looked at him one more time with that steady, clear gaze. "All right," she said. "Let's go see who you are in your own territory." The journey west took 4 days in a comfortable carriage that Callum hired from the livery in Cheyenne. And Callum watched May watch the changing landscape with the attention of someone who has spent most of her life in one place and is calibrating a world that is larger than she had been living in. Mei Shen sat with his eyes alert and his hands resting quietly on his knees, taking in the territory with the patience of an old man who has learned that things reveal themselves at their own pace. The mansion appeared on the horizon of the 4th afternoon, and Callum saw it through May's eyes as he had not seen it through his own in years. Its size, its deliberate grandeur, the way it announced wealth from a distance of 2 miles with the straightforwardness of a statement that admits no ambiguity. It was a thing built to be seen, and it was seen. May said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You lived here." "I lived here. Alone. With Thomas and the household staff, yes." She looked at the mansion for another moment. Then she looked at Callum. "You must have been very lonely." He hadn't expected that, not skepticism or recalculation, but that simple, direct empathy, the recognition of what the house said not about wealth, but about absence. "Yes," he said, "I was." Thomas met them at the door with the professional deference that Callum had grown up with, and that now felt slightly foreign, like a language he had learned as a child and not spoken in a long time. The house was spotless, the estate running with the precision that Thomas had always maintained. Callum walked through the rooms with a different feeling than the one that had driven him away 7 months ago. Not revulsion, not the suffocation of meaninglessness, but a kind of clarity about what this place was and what it wasn't. It was a business headquarters that he happened to sleep in. It was not a home. He met with his lawyers the following morning, and the meetings were long and detailed and occasionally contentious because the water rights dispute was genuinely complex and required careful argument. He argued it carefully. He knew this work. 20 years of it had left him expert at the specific language of these negotiations, the way certain phrases opened avenues and others closed them, the way a well-placed concession could buy more than a hard-fought victory. But something was different in how he did it. The neighboring rancher, a man named Garrett, who had been using the dispute as a lever for a larger land grab, made an opening offer that was technically legal and effectively predatory. 6 months ago, Callum would have met it with superior legal firepower and won by attrition. Instead, he requested a recess and rode out to Garrett's property alone. They sat on Garrett's porch in the afternoon sun. "Both operations need water," Callum said. "Fighting in court cost both of us money and time we could spend better." He laid out a proposal for a shared water management system that would serve both properties with shared costs and shared governance. "I'll cover the engineering survey. You provide the labor and maintenance expertise." Garrett looked at him suspiciously. "You've got the better legal position. Why would you offer this?" "Because winning isn't the same as solving," Callum said. "And I've been learning that cooperation tends to produce better outcomes than competition when both parties actually need the same thing." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected." "I'm not entirely what I expected either." They shook hands. The lawyers on both sides were mildly confused but efficient. The board meeting was the harder thing. 6 investors around the dining table that had once hosted politicians and business magnates, and the kind of dinners at which significant things happened while everyone pretended they were just eating. 6 men who had invested in Callum Rourke's operation because Callum Rourke was the kind of man who turned other people's capital into returns and who wanted to understand what had happened to the version of him they had invested in. He told them the truth. He had spent 7 months working as a day laborer in a frontier town. He had dug a water spring with his hands. He had helped a community fight off a predatory developer. He had learned things that he should have understood before now, and those things had changed how he intended to run the operation going forward. "We're restructuring," he said, "smaller footprint, sustainable practices, profit sharing with the workers, partnerships instead of monopolies." The chairman, a man named Thurston, who had the specific inflexibility of someone whose worldview had been confirmed by success for too many years, looked at him as though he'd announced he was becoming a monk. "You're going to reduce returns by a third." "In the short term, yes." "That's unacceptable." "Then take my offer to buy out your shares at fair market value. I have lawyers here with the paperwork. Anyone who wants out, take it." He looked around the table. "Anyone who wants to try building something that actually works for the long-term, stay." 3 investors left, 2 stayed. A younger man named Patterson, who had been watching the proceedings with an expression of alert interest, lingered after the rest departed. "I want in on the restructured operation," Patterson said. "The old model is dying. People want to support businesses that act like they give a damn about something other than their own profits." He extended his hand. "Let's see if we can prove you're not crazy." "I might be," Callum said, shaking it, "but I'm probably right anyway." Mei had been moving through the mansion and its grounds those 2 days, with the particular curiosity of someone who is studying rather than judging. She asked Thomas questions that Thomas answered with an openness that surprised Callum, who had rarely asked Thomas anything. She walked the ranch with Mei Shen in the evenings, the old man's strength continuing to return in the dry, western air, talking in fragments of Cantonese and gestures about the land and the cattle and the particular quality of the light at this altitude. On the 3rd evening after Thomas had withdrawn and Mei Shen had retired, Mei and Callum sat on the porch in the cool of a May night looking out at the valley that was his inheritance. "Tell me what you see," Callum said. She was quiet for a moment. "I see something that was built for one purpose, that you want to use for a different one," she said. "The purpose it was built for was to demonstrate that Callum Rourke was powerful. The purpose you want it for now is to be responsible." She paused. "Those aren't incompatible, but it'll take work to make the first one serve the second." "Can it be done?" "I don't know. But the person trying to do it is recognizably the same person who dug through Wyoming bedrock, because he couldn't think of anything more honest to do." He turned to look at her in the dark. "The person I see here," she said, "is the same person I see in Red Spur. The circumstances are different. The scale is different. But the essential thing," she stopped, "the essential thing is the same." "What is that?" "Someone who knows what matters and is trying to act accordingly, even when it's difficult, even when there's an easier version available." Callum was quiet for a moment. "I love you," he said. The words were not dramatic. They were simply accurate. Mei looked at him. In the moonlight, her expression was the one he trusted most, direct, clear, honest. "I know," she said. "I've known for some time." She held his gaze. "I love you too, Callum Rourke, all of you, including the parts that still have things to learn." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They sat on the porch of the most expensive house in the Wyoming Territory, holding hands in the dark, looking out at land that could be something other than what it had been, and for a long time neither of them felt the need to say anything more. They rode back to Red Spur in the first week of June, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon in the kind of warmth that meant summer had truly come to the high Wyoming plateau. The town was different in summer, louder, more populated than new arrivals, who had come following the spring's promise, moving through the streets with the energy of people who have found a place they intend to stay. Children ran along the board sidewalks. The general store had extended its hours. The schoolhouse that had been discussed all spring was under active construction, framing up at the north end of the square. Callum stood in the square and watched a crew of men he knew, men he had worked alongside hammering joists into place in the afternoon sun, and felt something that he didn't think he had an adequate word for. Belonging, maybe, the specific belonging of a person who has done something with their body and their time for a place, and the place has become partly theirs because of it. Hank Doyle appeared at his shoulder, squinting at the construction. "Schoolhouse will be done by September if the weather holds," Doyle said. "They're planning to have a teacher in place by fall." "Good. Also," Doyle paused, "might be work coming up in the spring. Bigger operation. Some of us have been talking about a cooperative freight arrangement. Pool resources. Something that could grow with the town." Callum looked at him. "You want a business partner? I want to know if the person with relevant experience might be willing to put some skin in the game." Doyle's face was deadpan, but his eyes were not. "Not a rescue, a partnership. Equal say, equal risk." Callum looked at the schoolhouse going up in the afternoon light, at the spring's channels running clean and steady, at the town that had made itself and was still making itself. "I'm in," he said. He proposed to Mei on a Sunday evening in July beside the spring. Not with a ring, though he had one. A simple band that had belonged to his mother, carried in his coat pocket for 3 weeks, while he tried to find the right moment and learned that the right moment could not be calculated or arranged, only recognized. It was a quiet evening, warm and long lit, the mountains turning gold in the distance. They had been sitting beside the spring source on the hillside above town, where the water came out of the earth and began its journey toward people who needed it, talking about nothing in particular, which was to say, talking about everything. "Marry me," Callum said. No ceremony, no speech, just the words. Mei looked at him. "This is the real question," he said. "Not a gesture, not a display. Just, will you build this life with me? Not because I'm wealthy and not in spite of it, because I think we make each other better, and I want more years of that than I'll have without asking." She was quiet for a long moment. "You'll have to keep working," she said. "I'm not marrying someone who stops working." "I know. We live in Red Spur, not the mansion." "Of course. And you learn proper Cantonese, not the catastrophic version you've been inflicting on my father." He almost smiled. "I'll try my best. And if you lie to me again," she said, not with anger, but with the flat certainty of someone who has been through the alternative and knows what it costs, "the trust I'm giving you now does not come back a second time." "I know that." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I will." They married in August on a Saturday beside the spring that had started everything. The ceremony was small because they wanted it small, attended by the people they had become real to over the course of a year that neither of them would have predicted or designed in advance. Hank Doyle stood as Callum's witness, having declared privately to Callum that he was doing so under protest and would deny it afterward, then showed up 20 minutes early to make sure everything was in order. Dora Vance had organized the food with the specific efficiency of a woman who considers chaos a personal affront. Young Danny from the freight yard had somehow acquired a good suit and stood at the back with the solemnity of someone attending something important. Mei Shen, steady on his feet, now walked his daughter to stand beside the man who had ridden through mountain passes in the dark to bring medicine. And when he placed her hand in Callum's, he said quietly in Cantonese, "Take care of her." Callum answered in Cantonese. The pronunciation was terrible. Mei Shen made the sound that meant he was laughing while trying not to. The vows were simple and meant exactly what they said. Callum promised to be honest, to show up to work alongside her rather than for her to use what he had in service of things that mattered, rather than in service of accumulation. Mei promised to trust him with the trust that was the hardest thing she had ever given, and to tell him honestly when he got it wrong. Dr. Harrison pronounced them married. The celebration moved to the square and ran until the stars came out. Callum sat beside Mei at the long table with the townspeople around them, and Mei Shen on her other side telling a story that was making Dora Vance laugh in spite of herself. And he looked at it all, this ordinary, extraordinary thing, and understood with a completeness that needed no further argument that he had found what he had been looking for. Not someone who was impressed by Callum Rourke. Someone who believed in the man he was working to become. Someone who handed him a tin cup at a public well and asked for nothing in return, and in doing so had shown him the whole shape of what he was missing. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the town had gone to sleep, and the spring ran on in its quiet channel, Callum and Mei walked home through streets they both knew well. She had the tin cup. She always had it, now carried in her apron pocket most days, a reminder of where they had started. "You look thirsty," she said. He looked at the cup in her hand. Every time. She filled it from the spring's channel and handed it to him, and he drank and handed it back, and she drank, and they walked home. The tin cup sat on the shelf in their kitchen, through that dented and worn and more valuable than anything Callum owned. It was not a symbol. It was just a cup from a Tuesday afternoon when a stranger arrived at a public well and someone who didn't owe him anything gave him water anyway. It was also everything. In the deep cold of that first winter together, Callum stood in the freight yard loading a wagon beside Danny and two other workers, the air sharp enough to see his breath. His hands chapped inside good gloves, his back carrying the familiar, settled ache of someone who has been doing this long enough that the work has become part of the body's vocabulary. Mei appeared at noon with a basket. They sat on the bench overlooking the valley where the spring water ran through its new channels, even in the cold, feeding the cisterns and wells that fed the town, and they ate together and talked about ordinary things, the progress on the schoolhouse interior, Mei Shen's plan to teach Cantonese to the children who would attend it, the details of the cooperative freight arrangement that Callum and Doyle had been building since autumn. "Letter from Thomas," Callum said. "The ranch had a strong quarter." "That's good." The profit-sharing program made a difference. The workers are more invested. Mei poured tea. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised. I just keep finding out that the right things to do also work." She handed him the cup. "My mother used to say that integrity is also good business." It took the rest of the world a while to catch up. Callum took the tea and drank it. Across the square, the schoolhouse stood finished in the winter light, solid and new, waiting for the spring and the children who would come to it. The spring ran clean and constant. The town breathed around them, occupied with its own ordinary survival and ambition. He had left the richest man in the Western Territories in a mansion on a Tuesday morning before dawn and ridden east towards something he couldn't name. He had found it in a tin cup at a public well. He had lost it and worked to earn it back, and found that the working had done something to him, that the original finding had made him into someone who understood not just what he needed, but why not just what he wanted, but what it required. He had built an empire. He had also built a life. The life was harder, smaller, less impressive by every external measure, and infinitely more real. Mei leaned against his shoulder in the winter sun, and Callum Rourke, the richest man in the Western Territories, who had chosen the dust and found everything in it, sat still and let the moment be exactly what it was. Enough, more than enough, everything.